You don't realize how fast a family can turn your home into a battlefield until the first knock at the door sounds like a warning. That was the moment everything shifted for me. One small sound, one ordinary gesture, and suddenly, the life I had built, quiet, intentional, and finally stable, felt like it was tilting beneath my feet. For 18 months, my husband and I had been paying our mortgage in calm, predictable rhythms. Every bill, every receipt, every transfer, handled with the kind of diligence you'd expect from people determined to build a future without debts owed or favors dangling overhead. But beneath that quiet routine, something else had been brewing. A promise she claimed was generosity, reshaped into something sharper, something she wanted to reclaim in the form of control. She said she had helped us start our life. She said she had given the deposit from love. And we believed her, until she began reminding us, again and again, as though the house stood on ground she alone owned. What started as a gift twisted slowly into leverage. A request to talk became an expectation became entitlement. And then came the message that changed everything. I'll be moving in next month. No conversation, no question, just a declaration wrapped in family politeness. That was when I knew I needed to protect the home we built, not with anger, not with shouting, but with clarity, with paperwork, with boundaries that didn't bend. This is the story of how a quiet daughter-in-law drew a line against a tide of manipulation, and how that line saved everything. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. I set the folder flat on the dining table, smoothing the edge with the back of my hand the way someone might straighten a photograph before deciding whether to frame it. The cover felt dry, almost chalky, as if the paper had spent too long absorbing quiet things no one wanted to say aloud. A text from my mother-in-law lit up the corner of my phone. Short, clipped, deliberate. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I let my fingertips rest on the folder's spine, grounding myself in something real, while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Outside, the front porch light washed a warm rectangle across the floorboards, steady and unblinking. It made the house feel honest, even if the conversations inside it were not. I took a slow breath, reached for the phone, and lifted it just enough to see the preview of her message. Another reminder wrapped in politeness that never felt quite polite. My thumb hovered before I set the device down again, face down. She was bringing up the house deposit again. The way she repeated it, like a sacred favor held over my head, never changed. She said it as though her generosity had built the foundation by hand, as though each monthly reimbursement I sent her was optional, a gesture, not a commitment written clearly in our threads. I could still picture the note I typed the night we finalized it. $450 a month, mortgage reimbursement. Clean, neutral, with a timestamp that didn't tremble. I had paid every month, not one missed, not one late. But gratitude, in her vocabulary, tended to stretch into ownership, a slow shift of lines until you weren't sure what you had agreed to in the first place. I opened the folder just enough to glimpse the neat stack of statements inside, the faint scent of new paper rising as if nudging me toward clarity. A pot simmered softly in the kitchen, the lid tapping with tiny breaths of steam, reminding me the world beyond this tension still existed. The call came seconds later, her name pulsing across the screen like a metronome I had no intention of following. I answered anyway. It lasted less than 30 seconds. She told me she'd be moving in next month, her tone brightened by a confidence that assumed consent. I kept my voice steady, pared down to the essentials. "I hear you," I said, and nothing more. I refused to let emotion leak into the space between us. Language, after all, could be a weapon or a shield, depending on who held it. She spoke as though logistics were already settled, as though I were simply another detail she planned to arrange. When the call disconnected, the house exhaled. My reflection in the dark window looked composed, though my shoulders held an almost invisible tension. The porch light flickered slightly, as if acknowledging something was shifting. Whether in the house or in me, I couldn't yet say. I chose to move with precision, not panic. Strategic silence had a way of revealing more truth than any argument could force. I lifted my phone and took a quiet photo of the call log, the timestamp glowing like a breadcrumb left intentionally along a trail. The folder lay open beside me, its papers aligned in tidy, unemotional rows. I began downloading the relevant statements from the bank, every reimbursement, every confirmation email, each one a small anchor against distortion. The soft clicking of the laptop keys steadied me, each tap a reminder that facts didn't shout, they simply existed. The kitchen light cast a faint circle across the countertops, catching the rim of a glass I hadn't moved since breakfast. The room felt cooler than before, as if the temperature had dropped just enough to make the edges sharper. I saved each file in labeled order, closing nothing until the facts were lined up cleanly. A draft of air slipped through the window, brushing against my arm with the kind of chill that made you aware of your own breathing. Somewhere in the kitchen, a spoon tapped lightly against a bowl. My husband rinsing dishes, without knowing the quiet tectonic shift happening a room away. I pressed the folder shut with a soft, deliberate motion, letting the weight of the documents settle under my palm. My breathing evened out, the rhythm steadying, like a metronome returning to the right tempo. On the porch, the light reached just far enough to kiss the corner of the doormat, illuminating flecks of dust that rose when a breeze stirred. It was strange how calm the house felt, considering how quickly the ground beneath us had begun to move. I slid the folder closer to me, not out of fear, but preparation. The phone vibrated once, then again, a third time, and then it went completely still. I spent the next morning sorting through the old email threads I had avoided for months, clicking open each subject line that mentioned the bank, the house, or the deposit she insisted on calling a favor. Buried between two mundane promotional emails was the one I needed, its subject line sharp and unmistakable. Non-repayable gift. Seeing those words again steadied something in me. Not triumph, just clarity. I scrolled slowly, tracing the edges of the attached PDF that outlined the original terms in language clean enough to leave no room for reinterpretation. The cursor hovered before I downloaded it again, placing it carefully into a new folder on my desktop. The hum of the heater filled the room with a gentle static, and I leaned back slightly, letting the screen's glow soften the morning's unease. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the block. A low, repetitive sound that made the neighborhood feel ordinary in a way I needed. Once the document was secured, I began building a timeline of every reimbursement I had sent her. 18 months of transfers, neatly recorded. I opened a spreadsheet and typed the dates in one column, the exact dollar amounts in another, and the transaction codes in a third. It felt oddly grounding, like laying bricks in the exact order required for a stable wall. No embellishment, no interpretation, just the truth laid out row by row. By the time I finished the first half of the list, the room had warmed, sunlight cutting a clean stripe across the dining table. Dust drifted lazily through it, tiny flecks turning slow circles before disappearing. I paused long enough to stretch my hands, feeling tendons loosen, feeling purpose settle. The spreadsheet waited for the rest of the numbers, patient and steady, much like the version of myself I was trying to reclaim. Before continuing, I called a friend who worked in legal compliance, someone who understood the difference between what people claimed and what documents proved. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm in a way I needed more than I admitted. I explained the situation in simple, neutral terms, stripping the emotion out of it the way a surgeon removes excess tissue. When I asked her whether the distinction between a gift and a loan mattered here, she didn't hesitate. "Don't make this emotional," she said. "Let the paper talk, it'll do the job." I found myself nodding, even though she couldn't see it. The kettle clicked off in the background, sending a faint hiss of steam into the room. I thanked her and ended the call. Her advice wasn't comforting so much as stabilizing, like a railing on a staircase you didn't know you needed. I printed every page I had gathered so far, feeding the sheets one by one into the machine. The warm paper slid into my hand, still holding the faintest chemical smell of fresh ink. Each page felt like something solid, an anchor against revisionist memory. The printer let out its familiar short whir, followed by a quiet shift as the rollers repositioned for the next sheet. In the stillness of the house, even that tiny sound seemed to carry weight. When the stack was done, I tapped it gently against the table to align the edges, then slid the entire bundle into the folder. The cover closed with a soft, decisive whisper, almost like an exhale. I rested my fingers on the top for a moment, absorbing the quiet certainty of documented truth. It wasn't confrontation, not yet. It was preparation. I wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding, that somewhere between her intentions and my assumptions, the wires had crossed in ways neither of us intended. I carried that hope with me as I returned the folder to its place on the table, letting my hand linger on the cover. The house was calm, the kind of calm that made small sounds seem louder. The hum of the fridge, the faint buzz of the porch light through the front door glass. I took a slow breath, gathering the pieces of myself that felt scattered. Believing the best didn't mean ignoring the facts. It meant giving space for truth to stand on its own. I closed the laptop gently, the click echoing just enough to mark the moment. Then I pushed the chair back and stood. One thing was clear now. If the money had been a gift, there was no automatic right to move in, no assumed claim, no unspoken authority woven into the house's foundation. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a small but unmistakable shift, like a boundary beginning to form, quiet and firm. I gathered the utility bills first, pulling them from the small metal organizer we kept near the pantry. 12 months of electricity, water, and gas, each one stamped, dated, and paid by us. I spread them across the dining table in a careful row, the paper catching the soft morning light in uneven angles. Then came the HOA statements, each one a reminder of fees quietly handled without help from anyone claiming ownership. Insurance documents followed, the fine print outlining responsibility in a tone more honest than most conversations. I numbered each page in pencil, the graphite leaving a faint, dry whisper against the paper. The house felt unusually still, as though it understood what I was building, an unbroken trail of who had carried the real weight. A gentle tap from the sink announced a slow drip I hadn't noticed before, but even that small sound folded neatly into the silence around me. Next, I printed the message history, each reminder I had sent her about transferring the monthly reimbursement, each confirmation she had responded with. The timestamps were precise, neat, unemotional. They didn't argue or embellish, they simply sat there, side by side, forming a quiet ledger of truth. As the printer fed out the sheets, I felt a strange steadiness settle over me. I arranged the pages chronologically, aligning the corners with a practiced touch. The black ink bled slightly at the edges of some lines, giving the text a soft shadow under the dining room lamp. I didn't add commentary or notes. I wanted the record to speak without my voice shaping it. It reminded me of how clarity often hides in plain sight, waiting for the moment someone decides to actually look. I found the spare key photo tucked in my phone, a picture I'd taken the day we bought the house, when we celebrated by documenting every tiny milestone. I remembered placing the spare key on the counter, snapping the photo of its scratches and dents, a small history etched into the metal. Now that same picture gained new purpose. I printed it, watching the image slowly resolve into focus, each ridge on the key glinting under the printer's light. Holding the glossy sheet, I felt a mix of nostalgia and something sharper. Clarity, maybe, or resolve. I slid the photo into the growing stack of evidence. The edges felt cool against my fingertips. A shadow shifted across the porch as the wind moved a branch outside, the faint creak blending with the quiet rhythm of the house settling into itself. By the time I compiled everything, the table held a complete financial map. Money in, money out, responsibility tracked, and contributions unmistakably clear. I opened a blank document and drafted a summary for the lawyer, keeping the tone spare and factual. Each line I typed felt like clearing fog from a window. The more I wrote, the clearer the view became. Visibility before confrontation, I reminded myself, as I added labels to each section, creating a structure that would be impossible to misinterpret. The clock on the wall ticked with a steady rhythm, marking each second with a patience I found strangely reassuring. I reviewed the document twice before saving it, then placed the printed summary on top of the pile. The kettle began to whistle softly, the sound rising in a thin, steady thread. I walked to the stove and turned the knob, stopping the whistle mid-note. The steam curled upward, catching a beam of light from the window. For a moment, everything felt domestic and ordinary. Tea warming on the counter, the faint smell of toasted bread lingering from breakfast. I carried the mug back to the table, wrapping my hands around the warmth. The contrast between the comfort of the moment and the seriousness of the papers in front of me wasn't lost on me, but it didn't feel jarring. Life, I realized, rarely separated the mundane from the consequential. They existed side by side, shaping each other in ways we only understood later. I looked over the completed ledger one last time, feeling the weight of quiet certainty settle in my chest. Even if someone tried to twist the narrative, I had the truth organized, documented, and ready. The folder wasn't just preparation anymore. It was protection. She arrived without calling, stepping onto the front porch with the kind of confidence that suggested decisions had already been made. I met her at the doorway, keeping half a step of space between us. The late afternoon light stretched long across the boards, warming one side of her coat while leaving the other in shadow. She glanced past me into the house, eyes scanning the living room, as if evaluating which wall might best accommodate her presence. "I was thinking," she began, "the living room could be rearranged, maybe turned into my room. It's the largest space, and I'll need comfort at my age." Her tone was polite, but precise, one of those sentences shaped like a question, but delivered like a directive. I kept my hand lightly on the doorframe, grounding myself in the smooth grain beneath my palm. Her perfume drifted into the entryway, soft but insistent. Instead of responding to the suggestion itself, I asked the question that mattered. "Do you have a written agreement for residency?" My voice was even, almost gentle, the way you'd speak when confirming a detail rather than pushing back. Her expression shifted just slightly, enough to catch but not enough to name. She looked toward the yard instead of at me, waving a hand as if brushing off something trivial. "We're family," she said. "Why would we need paperwork? I gave money for this house. Isn't that enough?" The words landed with the familiar weight of expectation, of blurred lines drawn in pencil so she could erase and redraw them as needed. I waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the distinction clear. Family didn't replace agreements. Not here. Not anymore. When she stepped back to adjust the strap of her purse, I used the moment to jot a quick note in my phone. The day, the hour, the request she made. My thumb moved quietly over the screen, the soft taps nearly lost under the distant rumble of a passing car. I didn't record her tone or my interpretation, just the facts, clean and unembellished. She watched me, her brows tightening for a heartbeat, but she didn't comment. I slipped the phone into my pocket with a steady motion. The air between us grew denser, though neither of us raised our voice. Conflict didn't always need volume. Sometimes it lived in the space where expectations collided with boundaries. A faint draft swept across the porch, lifting the edge of the doormat and carrying the smell of fresh paint from the nearby wall. The house was still settling from last week's touch-ups, the fragrance lingering in a way that felt both new and unfinished. She looked down at the threshold, as if deciding whether to cross it, her foot shifting slightly on the wood. The sound of a car door, closing somewhere down the street, echoed toward us, crisp and distant. For a moment, we stood suspended in the heaviness of an unspoken reality. She was planning her arrival, and I was preparing for something entirely different. The tension didn't flare. It tightened, quietly, like a string being pulled taut. I inhaled slowly, letting the cold air steady my thoughts. If this was going to unfold, it needed to be handled with clarity, not emotion. I reminded myself that I didn't have to outtalk her. I just had to hold my ground. Facts were on my side, and I had prepared for precisely this moment. "We'll discuss everything in writing," I said, my tone soft but immovable. She blinked at the phrasing, perhaps surprised by the formality, perhaps annoyed by it. The porch light clicked on automatically as the sun dipped lower, spilling a golden haze across the boards. It illuminated the small tension in her jaw, the way she pressed her lips together before speaking again. "I'll think about it," she said, stepping back into the fading light. The words sounded like a concession, but the look she gave me suggested storms forming just beyond the horizon. That evening, after the house settled into its familiar quiet, I opened the contract again. The pages felt cooler than I remembered, the paper smooth beneath my fingertips. I read through each section slowly, letting my eyes trace the dense language with care. Details that once seemed distant now carried weight I could feel in my chest. When I reached the clause outlining cohabitation, I paused. The wording was unambiguous. Shared living required consent from all parties. I highlighted it in soft yellow, the color glowing faintly under the warm dining lamp. A shiver of relief moved through me, not triumph, just the calm that comes when the fog finally lifts enough to see the edges of the road. I let the contract rest open on the table and leaned back, listening to the faint ticking of the thermostat as the heat kicked on. I drafted an email, the kind that left no room for rephrasing or misinterpretation. The subject line was simple: housing boundary, written communication only. The cursor blinked patiently as I considered each sentence, choosing words that were firm without being hostile, clear without being cold. I explained that for the sake of accuracy and mutual understanding, all conversations moving forward needed to be in writing. No raised voices, no shifting narratives, just documentation. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally exhaled and typed the last line. When I hit send, the whoosh felt quieter than usual, almost absorbed into the room's stillness. The porch light cast a faint glow through the window, a steady reminder that boundaries didn't have to be loud to be real. I called my legal friend again, just a quick check before taking the next step. She picked up with a familiar steadiness and didn't need the entire recap. "Should I send the documents now or wait?" I asked. The line was quiet for a breath, broken only by the faint hum of static. "Send them now," she replied. "Be polite, be specific, and keep everything aligned." Her voice had the confidence of someone who has watched too many situations unravel simply because the right paper wasn't set down early enough. I thanked her. As I hung up, a faint vibration traveled through the floorboards.
someone upstairs shifting their weight, reminding me that even in moments of conflict, life continued its ordinary rhythms.
I gathered the documents I had prepared: the original gift letter, the reimbursement timeline, the message history. I placed each one in a neat stack before clipping them together with a matte black binder clip. The metal felt cool against my thumb. I slid the stack into the folder, the pages rustling softly as they settled into place. The room smelled faintly of printer ink and the lavender candle I had blown out earlier. It occurred to me that this folder, ordinary in appearance, had become the quiet backbone of my resolve. I closed it gently, making sure the spine aligned perfectly with the table's edge, and rested my hand on top, letting the steadiness of the moment sink in. What I wanted wasn't victory. It wasn't about proving her wrong or elevating myself into some moral high ground. I just wanted the space we lived in to feel like ours again, undisturbed, unchallenged, unclaimed by someone who saw generosity as leverage. I needed peace more than vindication, stability more than dominance. I poured a glass of water and sipped slowly, the coolness steadying me. Outside, the evening air thickened with the smell of damp leaves, the kind that clung to the edges of the porch steps. I watched the shadows deepen across the sidewalk, a soft gradient pulling the day toward closure. If she chose not to respond or chose to ignore the clarity I offered, I knew what the next step would be. Documentation had a way of anchoring truth, and if she remained silent, then her silence would speak just as loudly as any refusal. The next morning, I typed a message with the same care someone might use when stitching a seam: slow, steady, intentional. I outlined the conditions clearly: insurance coverage during her stay, respect for shared spaces, and a defined 30-day limit unless new terms were agreed upon in writing. My phone rested lightly in my hand as I reread the message, testing its tone the way you test the weight of something fragile before setting it down. When I finally hit send, a faint vibration buzzed through the device. Then the room returned to its quiet equilibrium. I set the phone on the counter beside a cooling cup of tea, the steam barely curling now. The house felt still in a way that wasn't empty, just watchful, like it was waiting to see what shape these new boundaries might take. Her response arrived barely a minute later, short, vague. "The house is family property. Let's not complicate things." I stared at the words, feeling the familiar slide between generosity and entitlement tighten again. The message was polite, but the implication beneath it felt like a hand gently pushing past a line I had drawn with care. I read it again and again, trying to find any sign of willingness to meet halfway, but the meaning stayed fixed. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a brief tremor through the bushes along the porch. It reminded me how easily something small could become something larger if left unattended. I took a screenshot of her message, labeling it with the date and time before saving it to the folder on my desktop. Then I captured my own message for the same purpose, pairing them side by side, like two pieces of evidence that explained one another without commentary. The soft click of the phone's buttons felt almost ceremonial. I added both screenshots to the printed file later, sliding them into the back of the folder until they settled with a faint whisper. Organization was its own form of courage, quiet, deliberate, and unmistakably firm. The overhead light hummed a low, steady tone. I set my mug down on the table, the ceramic tapping gently against the wood. Speaking out loud, even to an empty room, helped me steady the words I needed to choose. I repeated the conditions slowly, imagining how I would say them if this ever needed to be face-to-face again. Insurance, shared space, privacy, 30 days. Each term felt measured, neither harsh nor negotiable. The steam from the mug thinned and rose in a faint, wavering line, disappearing as it reached the cooler air above. For the first time in days, my voice didn't shake, not even a little. It felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized had slipped. I sat for a while, letting the quiet expand. I didn't want conflict. It was never what I sought. I wanted harmony. But harmony built on clarity, not submission. The chair creaked softly as I leaned back, the wood giving just enough to remind me of its age. Through the window, cars passed slowly, their headlights washing brief arcs of light across the living room wall. I breathed in deeply, letting the scent of fresh laundry drift from the hallway. Peace wasn't just the absence of tension. It was the presence of structure. And if structure required firmness, then firmness was what I would offer. If she rejected the conditions, the answer would reveal itself without drama or debate. Agreement required mutual respect, and without that there was nothing to discuss, only a line that remained where I placed it. Her next message was longer, polished but edged. She listed what she believed she needed in order to live comfortably. A main key to the house, access to household spending for shared benefit, and a dedicated room with a lock she alone controlled. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling the familiar tightness form at the base of my throat. None of it was phrased as a demand, but every sentence leaned in that direction. The language was soft only on the surface. Beneath it lived an expectation that I would bend, the way I had bent in smaller moments so many times before. I documented the message, fingertips steady as I saved it. The sun shifted through the blinds, slicing the room with thin bands of light that caught dust in the air. Even the dust felt suspended, waiting for what I'd say next. I replied with a single line. Please provide all requests in a signed written document. No emotion, no elaboration. Just the boundary. The moment I hit send, a hush spread through the room, as though the air itself recognized the shift from discussion to structure. I left the phone on the coffee table and folded a blanket over the back of the couch, grounding myself in a simple domestic gesture. A car drove past outside, its tires rolling over loose gravel with a steady crunch. I didn't feel triumphant, only clear. Clarity had its own quiet temperature, cool, level, unshaken. Word traveled faster than I expected. Later that day, while I was watering the plants near the front window, she approached our neighbor across the street. Their voices carried just enough for me to hear fragments. Gentle statements about how she had helped us get the house, and how she hoped her generosity wouldn't be forgotten. By the time she glanced toward our window, the story was already shaped. I stepped back from the curtains, not hiding, just choosing not to participate. When she eventually caught my eye, I smiled, a small, polite curve of the mouth that neither confirmed nor contradicted anything. I wouldn't defend myself on the sidewalk. Some conversations didn't belong in the open air. The sun was harsh that afternoon, retreating only slowly from the edges of the porch. As it moved, the glare softened and pulled back from the threshold, leaving behind a muted warmth on the floorboards. I stood at the entrance for a moment, feeling the shift in temperature brush across my skin. The light no longer pressed against the house. It drifted away. Gentle, but firm, the way a boundary should be. The sound of a distant lawnmower rolled in and out with the breeze, reminding me that the world outside my doorway was moving on, unswayed by the tension pooling just behind it. I thought back to the winter she stepped into our kitchen and made me soup when I was too sick to stand. She had moved around the room with a kind of brisk tenderness, scolding me for not resting enough, placing a warm hand on my shoulder as she set the bowl in front of me. That memory rose without warning, softening the edges inside me. It wasn't that she was incapable of kindness. She had simply learned to weave it with control, stitching the two together in a way that made them hard to separate. Holding both truths at once wasn't easy but necessary. People were never just one thing. I stayed calm, letting the clarity settle deeper in my spine. Whatever happened next, I would not escalate. I would not be baited or cornered. I would hold the line exactly as drawn, not sharper, not softer, steady enough to meet whatever push came next. I placed the house key on the dining table with a small, deliberate motion, the metal making a soft click against the wood. It was not a gesture of surrender nor an invitation, just a pause, a reset. A reminder to myself that no argument needed to escalate beyond a single measured choice. My hand lingered above the key for a moment before I pulled it back, fingers curling loosely, as if releasing tension held far too long. The morning light drifted through the window in thin, pale strips, brushing across the table and catching the faint scratches on the key's surface. I sat down slowly, letting the stillness wrap around me. In that quiet, I realized something had shifted. I no longer felt the urge to justify myself. I didn't owe theatrics or explanations, only clarity. I drafted a new email, attaching the written communication request again, along with a clear checklist of conditions. The language was the same as before, polite, consistent, steady. But this time the message carried a different weight. I wasn't asking for cooperation, I was setting structure. After rereading it twice, I hit send. The tiny whoosh echoed faintly in my chest, like a breath released after being held too long. I turned off notifications on my phone and slid it across the table. The device vibrated once almost immediately, then again, but I didn't pick it up. I had already set the terms. Anything further could wait until it arrived in the format I requested. The quiet that followed felt clean. She began calling, first once, then in a quick succession that filled the room with muffled buzzing. I stared at the dark screen, watching her name pulse and fade, refusing to be pulled into a conversation designed to blur lines. When the ringing stopped, I typed a single message. Please email. Nothing more. The silence between us stretched, thick and unbroken. A sparrow landed on the porch railing outside, hopping lightly along the edge before fluttering away. For a moment, the faint beat of its wings felt like the only thing moving in the entire house. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet return to its natural shape. The ceiling fan creaked softly overhead, a rhythmic sound that had always annoyed me on warm days. Now, it felt grounding. I took a slow sip of water, the glass cool against my palms, then stood and opened the back door to let in a breath of fresh air. The early afternoon breeze carried a hint of something sweet, cut grass from a yard down the block maybe, or the faint scent of someone's dryer sheet drifting through the neighborhood. The moment felt ordinary, almost tender in its simplicity, a small reminder that life continued outside the orbit of conflict. I leaned against the doorframe, breathing in deeply until the tension in my shoulders began to loosen. As I moved through the kitchen, I realized the fear that had once tightened my chest was loosening, replaced by something steadier. It wasn't boldness, it was clarity, the kind that arrives only when truth is laid out cleanly in front of you. I wiped the counter absent-mindedly, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of a passing truck. For the first time in days, the house didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like a place where I could breathe, where decisions didn't have to be dramatic to be firm. I touched the back of a chair lightly, grounding myself in the ordinary texture of the wood. I looked at the key resting on the table, the sunlight sliding across its worn ridges. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. My hand stayed still, steady, open, no longer bracing, no longer grasping, just certain. In the late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from a distant cousin of hers, someone I barely spoke to but who occasionally shared family updates in a friendly, arm's-length way. This time, the message contained a screenshot, a group chat where she'd written, "The deposit was a loan actually. I'm only asking for what's fair." I stared at the image, letting the words settle in their full, deliberate contradiction. The timestamp was clear, her phrasing careful enough to sound reasonable, but pointed enough to shape a narrative. I saved the screenshot immediately, noting the time before sliding the phone onto the table. Outside, a faint drizzle began tapping against the window, soft and persistent, like someone knocking gently to be let in. I watched the droplets gather and roll down the glass before I turned away. I added the screenshot to the evidence folder, placing it beneath the reimbursement timeline. The contrast between her claim and the documented truth was stark. Two parallel lines that would never meet. I opened the ledger I had been compiling and entered a new row, labeling it clearly but without commentary. Facts didn't need adjectives. They carried their own weight. After saving the file, I closed the laptop and sat back, feeling the chair creak lightly beneath me. The house felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that sharpened the edges of every small sound. The rain, the ticking clock, the soft shifting of the wooden floor. Clarity had a texture to it, and today it felt almost tangible. I called my legal friend, keeping the conversation brief. "There's new information," I said. "Verbal claims contradicting written terms." She exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, the sound steady and unsurprised. "Don't respond," she said. "Not verbally, not casually. Documentation only. Let them talk. Just don't talk back. Unless it's in writing." Her advice slipped into place like a puzzle piece, completing the picture I already knew I was building. I thanked her and ended the call. The quiet that followed didn't feel empty. It felt controlled. I put my phone face down, the screen darkening into a small, steady square. The rain outside deepened, carrying the earthy scent of wet pavement through the crack of the open window. I closed it gently, listening as the sound softened to a muted rhythm. The cool air brushed against my skin before it disappeared, leaving behind a faint trail of goosebumps. I stood still for a moment, absorbing the texture of the moment, the low hum of the refrigerator, the soft drip from the gutter, the steady patter on the roof. Conflict had a way of shrinking the world to tight corners, but the weather reminded me that life was larger than this narrow tension. The room dimmed slightly as clouds thickened overhead, turning the afternoon into a quiet gray. I sat back down and looked at the folder. Its weight hadn't changed, but the story it held had deepened. Each new piece of information felt like another stitch in a seam that was becoming impossible to tear out. My hands rested on the table, palms flat, feeling the faint grain of the wood beneath my skin. For days I had been moving through these decisions with a tightness in my chest, but now something steadier was taking shape. I wasn't reacting, I was responding. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of clarity that didn't need to raise its voice. The lamp above cast a soft, warm glow, rounding the edges of the room. What she said in private circles no longer startled me. People reached for stories that protected their pride. But what mattered, what would matter when the situation reached its pivot, was the record. And the record was becoming undeniable. That night, when the house had settled into its familiar evening hush, I pulled the folder closer and opened it slowly. The edges of the cover felt slightly worn now, softened from being handled, but the spine still held firm. I slipped my fingers under the top clip, lifting the first set of documents. The metal felt cool, almost cold, against my skin. For a moment, I simply looked at the stack. Pages that once felt like mere administrative details, now carrying the weight of boundaries I hadn't known I would have to defend. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent of paper and faint ink rise. The dining lamp cast a warm glow across the documents, illuminating the clean lines of text. I threaded my hand under the clip, steadying the stack before continuing.
Each gesture felt intentional, like reassembling something fragile but necessary. I paused at the contract again, letting my eyes trace the clause that outlined residency. The language was unmistakably clear. Consent required, terms defined, boundaries built into the structure of the agreement itself. I traced one of the highlighted lines lightly with the side of my thumb, the soft yellow shining under the light. Her words from earlier, claims of loan, implied rights, felt distant compared to the precision on this page. I leaned back, letting the tension in my shoulders ease. The truth wasn't loud. It simply existed, steady and immovable. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sliding across the wall in a narrow arc before dissolving. I allowed myself a moment to breathe in that clarity. Then I opened my laptop and drafted the message for the attorney, laying out 3 structured options in clean bullet points: conditional residency, alternative arrangements, or no residency at all due to lack of consent. The cursor blinked, reflecting the weight of each word. I kept the tone neutral,
stripping the text of anything that could be interpreted as emotional. It was strange how writing plainly could feel like an act of strength. When I finished, I attached the relevant documents, checking each file twice before adding the next. The soft click of the trackpad punctuated the quiet room. The air smelled faintly of the cooled dinner still lingering from earlier. The sound of paper shifting filled the room as I turned to the next set of pages. The movement produced a clean, crisp whisper, like a thin blade slicing through silence. I felt the texture of the paper under my fingertips, smooth and firm, anchoring me back to the present. The world outside continued in its quiet way, the faint hum of a car several streets over, the soft tapping of a branch against the window pane as the wind picked up. I tilted the document slightly, watching the shadow shift across it. The details were simple, factual, unemotional. They didn't flare or argue, they clarified. I sat still for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. Not heavy, not crushing, just real. There was no joy in any of this, no satisfaction in being right. What I felt was quieter, a correction, a leveling, the adjustment of something that had long been tilted off center. Financial fairness wasn't about punishment, it was about alignment. As I closed the folder again, the sound was soft, almost tender, like placing a book back in its rightful spot on a shelf. The lamp above cast warm light across the table, smoothing the harshness of the moment into something manageable. What I had now was enough, a complete, orderly record ready for whatever came next. And the truth, laid out cleanly in ink, didn't waver. I created a clean, structured page outlining the conditions for residency. No rhetoric, no emotional edges, just the facts. Insurance coverage for any accident or damage. A fair contribution to utilities and HOA fees. Respect for common areas and boundaries around private space. A clear limit on duration, unless mutually revised in writing. I typed each item deliberately, spacing them so they stood on their own, uncluttered and unmistakable. When I printed the page, the ink still smelled faintly sharp as I lifted it from the tray. I placed it on the table beside the growing stack of documents, watching the paper curl slightly at the edges as it cooled. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the house, making the siding creak in small, familiar intervals. It felt like the world was settling into evening, everything easing into its place. I added a firm but reasonable deadline, 7 days for a written response, with signatures. Not an ultimatum, just structure. The printer hummed again as the header printed, the date settling neatly at the top of the page. I tapped the corner of the sheet lightly against the table to straighten the edges, then set it down beside the contract already open to the residency clause. Together, the documents formed a kind of quiet geometry, facts arranged with intention, leaving no space for misinterpretation. The dining light cast a warm glow across the table, illuminating the subtle variations in the paper's texture. I could feel calm returning, not because the situation was resolved, but because I had defined the terms clearly. I printed 2 copies of everything, one for her, one for my records. I chose 2 different binder clips so I could distinguish them without thinking. Matte silver for the one I'd give her, matte black for the one I'd keep. The clips closed with a soft, decisive click, anchoring the pages together. I placed both stacks side by side and looked at them for a moment. The room felt balanced in an oddly literal way. The 2 bundles, equal but separate. A faint draft passed through the doorway, rustling the top page of each stack. I smoothed them down gently, feeling the coolness of the paper under my palm. The smell of fresh ink mingled with the last traces of dinner from the kitchen. Garlic, butter, something faintly herbal. It grounded the moment in something human, something real. I gathered the documents and placed them carefully in the folder, the edges sliding in with a soft whisper. The house had grown quiet again, the kind of evening silence that made the smallest sounds feel amplified. The ticking of the thermostat, the subtle hum of the fridge, the muted thump of a car door somewhere down the street. Life continued in small, familiar rhythms, unaffected by the tension threading through ours. The longer I sat with the completed packet, the more I felt a strange sense of neutrality settle in. This wasn't about winning or asserting dominance. It was about fairness, about ensuring that we shared space on terms that honored everyone's dignity. If she agreed and respected them, there could be peace. If she didn't, then the boundary was already drawn. I leaned back in the chair, letting my shoulders relax as I listened to the distant hum of traffic, softened by the closed windows. The light above cast a soft golden circle across the table, making the documents appear almost gentle. Clear expectations had a way of illuminating everything, and now, with the terms articulated and preserved in ink, I felt ready, steady, for the next step, whatever form it took. The next morning carried the soft gray light of a sky debating whether to rain. I stood at the front door with the sealed envelope in my hand, the weight of the papers inside light but decisive. When I opened the door, the air felt cool against my skin, clean, almost expectant. She was already approaching from the walkway, her steps slow, her coat pulled tighter around her shoulders, as if bracing for something she couldn't name. I didn't move toward her. I simply held my ground on the threshold, the boards beneath my feet steady and familiar. When she reached the bottom step, I extended the envelope with a calm, measured motion. My voice stayed steady. "These are the terms," I said. "If you'd like to live here, these need to be met." The wind carried the faint rustle of the envelope as she hesitated before taking it. I spoke slowly, making sure every word landed without force, without heat. "You're welcome to stay if these conditions are met. If not, we'll find another arrangement. But everything has to be in writing." The air between us felt fragile, stretched thin by the weight of expectation and the quiet insistence of clarity. I didn't lecture or justify. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set the structure in place, offering the same steadiness I had held on to in the days leading up to this moment. Her fingers tightened around the envelope, the crisp paper bending slightly under her grip. The porch light clicked on, its motion sensor triggered by her presence, casting a soft glow across the steps. She turned her face slightly away, blinking more rapidly than usual. I could see the glimmer in her eyes even before she lifted her hand to swipe it away. Her voice, when she found it, was small and uneven. "I didn't think it would come to this," she murmured. There was no anger in it, just a complicated blend of pride and hurt collapsing into something softer. She didn't tear the envelope open. She didn't argue, not yet. She just held it against her chest as though steadying herself. A gust of wind stirred her hair, sending a few strands across her cheek. She brushed them away without looking at me, her posture folding inward for a brief second. A thin drizzle began, the drops landing in irregular patterns along the porch step, darkening the wood in small expanding circles. The envelope in her hand grew faintly damp along the edge, the moisture creeping into the corner like a slow exhale. She glanced down at it, then back up at me, as if realizing how literal this moment had become. Our conversation marked physically in the paper she held. The distant hum of a passing car blended with the patter of rain, softening the space around us. The cool air brushed against my face, carrying the clean scent of wet pavement and early morning quiet. I hadn't wanted it to be a confrontation. I still didn't. What I wanted was peace. Peace with structure. Peace without resentment simmering beneath unspoken expectations. I took a breath, letting it settle through my chest before speaking again. "I'm not choosing distance," I said. "I'm choosing clarity, so we can actually get along." Her shoulders lifted and fell on a trembling breath, as if something inside her was adjusting, resisting, then accepting, then unsure again. The rain thickened slightly, tapping against the railing in a steady rhythm, grounding the moment in something real and immediate. The envelope, damp along one edge, rested at an angle against her coat. She didn't open it. She didn't speak again. She simply nodded, slow, conflicted, but unmistakably acknowledging the shift. Behind us, the porch light held steady, its glow catching on the wet boards like a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. The first response didn't come from her, but from a relative, an uncle who rarely contacted us except on holidays. His message arrived mid-afternoon, tidy and formal, suggesting we reconsider the tone and avoid unnecessary paperwork between family. I read it twice, feeling the familiar pattern of triangulation reveal itself like a faint watermark on the page. I crafted a brief reply, attaching the gift document and the reimbursement ledger without commentary. "For clarity," I wrote, "these are the terms originally agreed upon." I kept the language even, neutral. The moment I hit send, a faint stillness settled in the room, as though the air itself acknowledged that the narrative was beginning to shift. Outside, a child's laughter echoed faintly from down the street, bright and unbothered, cutting through the heaviness with something almost innocent. Another message flashed onto my screen, this time from her, short, defensive. "I thought we were past all this. You're making me feel unwelcome." I exhaled slowly, letting the words settle without letting them pierce. I responded with the same structure I had used before, attaching the original gift document and the ledger once more. "I'm aiming for clarity and fairness," I wrote, "not exclusion." The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence, waiting for something I chose not to add. I stopped there. In the silence that followed, I felt the interior of the house steady itself. Walls, air, everything holding a kind of quiet firmness. The refrigerator hummed with its low, familiar rhythm, grounding me in something ordinary. A cousin reached out next, her tones soft, almost pleading. "Can't you just let it go?" she wrote, "for the sake of peace?" I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Peace without boundaries isn't peace, it's pressure. I didn't elaborate, didn't justify. I simply sent the words as they were. She responded with a single sad face emoji, which somehow felt more revealing than any paragraph she might have written. When the notification faded, I turned my phone face down on the table, the gentle thud sounding final.
The house felt dimmer as the sun lowered, the shadows stretching long across the floor. Outside, the porch light flickered briefly as dusk settled in, casting a muted glow across the walkway. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. The scent of someone grilling a few houses away drifted over, a mix of char and spice that pulled me back to summers when she and I had laughed together in easier times. A gust of wind rustled the leaves across the sidewalk, scattering them into small spirals. For a moment I stood there, feeling both anchored and unsettled. The light breeze cooled my face, reminding me that tension didn't erase memory. The past wasn't gone. It simply wasn't the guide for the present. I returned inside and sat at the table,
staring at the folder for a moment before opening it again. The documents felt heavier now, not in weight but in implication. They no longer represented preparation. They represented a path I had chosen and would follow through. I rested my hands beside the papers, palms down, grounding myself in the texture of the wood beneath them. I didn't want hostility. I didn't want her to feel shut out or diminished. What I wanted was something quieter, respect, mutual footing, truth without distortion. The lamp above cast a soft cone of light that gathered around the folder like a calm perimeter. I wasn't entering a fight. I was entering alignment. If others misunderstood, I could live with that. What I couldn't live with was the erosion of my own boundaries in the name of keeping peace that wasn't truly peace at all. The next morning, I booked an appointment with the county clerk. The website loaded slowly, its blue and white interface flickering as though unsure of its own stability. But eventually the confirmation appeared. Thursday at 10:15 a.m. I wrote the time down on a sticky note and placed it beside the folder. Then I opened a blank document and began preparing a one-page summary. Everything distilled into clean, factual lines. Original gift documentation, reimbursement timeline, residency terms, misstatements circulating within the family. No embellishments, just a framework any third party could read without needing backstory. The soft clacking of the keyboard felt rhythmic, almost soothing. The room around me settled into morning stillness, touched only by the faint hum of the heater kicking on. Outside, early sunlight slid across the porch, slow and careful. I divided the summary into 3 columns: facts, terms, requested actions. The structure felt balanced, almost mathematical. In the facts column, I listed dates and documents. In terms, I referenced the specific clauses. And in actions, the steps I needed the clerk's office to acknowledge. I printed a draft copy and spread it out on the table. The paper was warm from the machine, its edges still slightly curved from heat. I reread each line with a deliberate calm, making very small adjustments, an added comma, a rephrased clause, a date confirmed. The morning air held a faint sharpness, the kind that made each breath feel clean. I placed the edited version under the clip with the rest of the documents. Then I opened the county portal again and uploaded a preliminary version of the summary, along with the supporting documents. The progress bar moved slowly, inch by inch, as if acknowledging the weight of what it carried. When the submitted confirmation appeared, a small wave of relief washed through me. Not triumph, simply order taking shape. I closed the laptop softly, the sound a muted click in the quiet room. The sun shifted across the floor, warming the boards in uneven stripes. I stood for a moment, stretching my spine, letting my lungs expand fully. It felt like readiness, not dread. In the kitchen, I washed my hands and caught the faint, sterile scent of the county office in my memory. The smell of disinfectant, laminated notices, and the distant murmur of people waiting. That same scent seemed to linger in my mind now as I dried my hands with a soft towel. The air from the vent above drifted downward in a steady, temperate stream. I could almost imagine the clerk's window, the metal tray where forms are exchanged without ceremony, the slow stamp that marks receipt and legitimacy. These thoughts didn't make me anxious. They organized something inside me, the way an internal compass finds north again. Clarity, true clarity, had begun reshaping the fear that used to sit like a stone in my chest. Now, instead of weight, I felt lines, structure, direction. The kind that didn't need to be sharp to be firm. I returned to the dining table and reviewed the folder once more, silently acknowledging how much it had grown, how its contents mapped the path from confusion to coherence. The lamp above cast a calm amber light over the papers, softening their edges until they almost looked gentle. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, steadying myself in the quiet. What came next would depend on their response, or their lack of one. But I had the acknowledgement from the clerk scheduled, the documents aligned, and the path forward marked with clean, patient lines. The clerk's office was quieter than I expected. When I arrived, a single row of plastic chairs lined the wall, their metal legs scratching faintly against the tile whenever someone shifted. I stepped up to the window, the folder tucked securely under my arm. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with calm eyes and the kind of patience that comes from dealing with forms all day, gestured for the documents. I opened the folder with care, the spine making a soft crack as it released the pages. She took each one slowly, her gaze moving in a measured rhythm, scanning, pausing, scanning again. When she returned the file, she nodded once, a small sign of comprehension that carried more weight than words. A moment later, as I adjusted the folder in my hands, the faint sound of the cover flexing filled the otherwise still room. She pulled my summary toward her and read through it with deliberate attention. Every few seconds she made a small notation on her pad, a tiny checkmark, a brief underline. Her quiet professionalism felt like an anchor, grounding the room in procedure rather than emotion. "This is clear," she finally said, tapping the page lightly with her pen. "Complete and well organized." She shifted to her computer and entered the details into the system, her fingers moving with steady precision. Behind her, a small calendar flipped slightly in the draft from a vent, the paper edges fluttering like a soft exhale. When she looked up again, her expression held a kind of pragmatic reassurance that made something in me settle. She turned to the scanner next, lifting the lid with a smooth motion. "We'll finalize the timestamp and upload it for your records," she said. The machine hummed as it warmed, then a beam of light swept across the pages with a slow, deliberate glide. The scanned copies appeared on her monitor, crisp and orderly. She nodded once more. "Everything is in good shape." Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen too many messy cases to underestimate a well-prepared one. I watched the process unfold with a strange mixture of calm and clarity, knowing that each digital file tightened the framework around the truth. The final step was the seal. She pressed a button on a compact machine beside her, and it emitted a brief, warm whir. Then she lifted a newly stamped page and offered it to me through the metal tray. The seal gleamed slightly, still warm to the touch. The warmth spread faintly through the paper, radiating into my fingertips. It reminded me, unexpectedly, of the feeling of something being affirmed, not emotionally, but structurally. Behind us, someone's shoes squeaked against the floor as they approached the line, but the moment remained contained, almost intimate in its precision. I slipped the sealed page into the folder, making sure it lay flat. A lightness settled into me. Not relief, not triumph, but a gentle quiet, like the release that comes after holding a breath for too long. The clerk handed me a printed confirmation of the submission, her tone still steady. "You're all set," she said. I thanked her and stepped back, closing the folder with a soft snap. The office smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm toner, a scent I suddenly associated with order. As I walked toward the door, sunlight spilled across the entryway, its brightness muted by the frosted glass panels. I pushed the door open and felt the cool outdoor air meet my skin, carrying away the last trace of the sterile office scent. With the stamped documents secured and the formal review complete, I left the building knowing I had crossed an invisible line, no longer preparing, but ready. The path ahead wasn't uncertain anymore. It was simply the next step, clearly marked. Back home, I placed the stamped documents in the drawer where we kept important records: birth certificates, insurance papers, the mundane architecture of adult life. The drawer slid shut with a muted thud, and the house seemed to exhale around me. Still, the next steps required caution. I sat on the couch with my laptop open and made a simple list titled Contingencies. I wrote down the first: change the locks if necessary. Not immediately, not preemptively, only if boundaries were crossed. The words looked stark on the screen, but they were not written out of fear, just readiness. A subtle draft moved through the living room as the heater shut off, brushing cool air along my ankles. I tucked my feet under a blanket and continued typing, not rushed, not rattled, just steady. Preparation wasn't pessimism, it was care. The second item was installing a doorbell camera. I chose one that captured clear footage and logged motions with timestamps. When the package arrived 2 days later, I set it on the kitchen counter and read through the instructions twice before starting. The device clicked into place with a satisfying firmness, its small lens reflecting the porch in a dark, glassy oval. Testing it, I pressed the button and listened as a sharp, bright chime rang inside the house. Clean, distinct, impossible to miss. I repeated the test, watching the notification appear on my phone with precise time details. The technology didn't make me feel safer, exactly. It made the situation transparent. Transparency mattered. The third contingency was a trespass notice, unsigned, unserved, tucked quietly into the folder as a last resort. I drafted it with the same calm tone that had guided all my documentation so far. Nothing accusatory, nothing emotional. Just conditions and consequences, written plainly. I didn't want to use it, and I hoped I wouldn't have to. But knowing it existed, ready but dormant, eased a pressure I hadn't realized had been building. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, drawing thin lines across the hardwood floor. Dust floated lazily in the beams, drifting without direction. I watched the particles for a moment, grounding myself in the stillness. When everything was in place, I walked through the house slowly, testing the camera feed room by room. Each notification chimed with a quick, crisp tone, matching the short echo of my footsteps. The windows rattled faintly as the wind picked up outside, a restless whisper threading through the edges of the siding. I paused by the front door, running my fingers along the frame. The wood felt cool, solid, familiar. The doorbell camera glowed with a small blue ring, steady and silent. I locked the door, not out of anxiety but out of habit, then stepped back. The house felt both protected and transparent, like a space finally ready for whatever came next. I sat at the dining table again, the same place where all of this had started. The folder rested beside me, thinner than before, its contents now organized into sections that mapped the entire journey. History, terms, evidence, Procedure. My hand brushed the cover lightly, almost in acknowledgement. Fear no longer sat in my chest. Instead, there was a sense of structure, measured, calm, deliberate. I no longer felt like someone bracing for impact. I felt like someone who had prepared properly, who understood the situation clearly, who was ready to respond rather than react. Preparation didn't mean escalation, it meant steadiness. Knowing that whatever unfolded next, I wouldn't be caught off guard or pressed into panic. I had put everything in place not to fight, but to remain grounded. We agreed to meet for 15 minutes, no more, no less. I chose the living room because the soft light from the window made the space feel neutral, almost diplomatic. She arrived exactly on time, stepping inside with a cautious stiffness, as if unsure of the temperature of the conversation she was walking into. I had already placed a chair across from mine, angled just enough to avoid feeling adversarial. When she sat down, I opened my notebook and read the 4 points I needed to cover, slowly, evenly, without embellishment. Insurance, shared utilities, privacy, duration. Each word settled into the air with the same calm precision I'd rehearsed. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The quiet between us was thin, stretched, but not hostile. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I remembered, less commanding, more fragile. "I just wanted a place to rest," she said. "Somewhere to feel included." For a moment, the years of complicated history flickered in her expression. The pride, the disappointment, the small hurts that had accumulated like sediment. Her eyes didn't meet mine at first. They stayed focused on the window, where sunlight was slipping over the sill in a thin, bright line. The vulnerability in her tone caught me off guard, not because it was new, but because it was rarely spoken aloud. I let the silence breathe rather than rush to fill it. "I'm not shutting you out," I said, keeping my voice soft but steady. "I'm asking for structure, for everyone's sake." She finally lifted her eyes, searching mine the way someone looks for exits or answers. "I feel like you don't trust me," she whispered. The truth hovered between us, unspoken, complex. I didn't deny it, but I didn't weaponize it either. "I need boundaries to feel safe," I replied. "Not from you personally, but from the uncertainty." She held the cup of water I'd offered earlier, and I noticed her fingers trembling slightly against the glass. Her breath hitched, barely audible. The room felt suspended, held delicately in the moment. The light shifted as a cloud passed outside, dimming the brightness around us. She set the cup down, her hands folding again in her lap, this time less tightly. "I didn't realize things had gotten so formal," she said, her voice trailing off at the end. I nodded gently. "Formality removes misunderstandings," I said. "It protects both sides." Her shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in a quiet acknowledgement. She exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something she had held tight for far too long. The sound of a car rolling past drifted faintly into the room, grounding the moment in ordinary life. I waited, letting the space remain open but contained. For the first time in weeks, I felt something soften inside me. Not the boundary, but the temperature around it. She wasn't a villain, just someone who had learned to weave affection with control, until the two became indistinguishable. I could see the tenderness beneath her habits, the way she'd once placed a blanket on my shoulders when I'd fallen asleep on the couch, the way she'd scolded me gently for skipping meals. Those memories didn't erase the present conflict, but they complicated it, grounding it in humanity rather than grievance. "I want things to be calm," I said. "But calm requires clarity." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Whether she would agree to the terms was still uncertain, but the conversation had shifted. We weren't clashing anymore, we were aligning, even if unevenly. And I held the line without raising my voice, without shrinking, without yielding the structure I had built. The choice now rested with her. 2 days passed before she reached out again. The message was long, winding, and carefully phrased, an attempt at compromise delivered entirely through sentiment rather than structure. She suggested a verbal understanding, something flexible, something that didn't require signatures or documents. I read it slowly, line by line, feeling the familiar pull toward accommodation rise like an old reflex. But clarity had taken root in me. It no longer wavered. I typed my response with steady hands. All agreements must be written and signed. It protects both of us. I didn't add justification, apology, or explanation. I simply sent it. Outside, a bird tapped briefly against the window before fluttering away, leaving a faint pattern on the glass. The house felt still, as though holding a collective breath. I placed the phone face down on the table, letting the decision settle. Her reply came minutes later, shorter this time, edged with frustration. "Why are you making this so difficult?" she wrote. I inhaled deeply and set my phone aside without answering immediately. I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with cool water, and let the sound of the faucet steady me. The refrigerator hummed in a low, even tone. Only after a full minute passed did I sit back down and type. Written agreements ensure fairness, nothing more. The words felt neither harsh nor defensive, only precise. She didn't respond right away. The silence stretched across the afternoon, filling the room with a kind of suspended stillness. A thin beam of sunlight crossed the table, warming the edge of the folder, as if marking the boundary between her uncertainty and my resolve. By evening, she sent another message, this one lighter, attempting to soften the situation. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said. "I just want us to get along." I read those words with a mixture of tenderness and understanding. She meant them, in her way. But underneath them lived the same expectation, that harmony could replace structure, that goodwill could stand in for clarity. I typed back gently. "We can get along better with clear expectations. It prevents misunderstandings later." A pause followed, long enough for me to hear the quiet ticking of the thermostat, the faint stretch of wood settling in the walls, the slow cooling of the day. When her typing bubble appeared, it flickered on and off like breath starting and stopping. She eventually suggested we meet again, just to talk it out. I recognized the tactic, a return to casual conversation that could blur the clean lines we had drawn. I responded with care. "I'm open to talking, but nothing replaces the written terms." The message sat on the screen like a small pillar, simple, unshaken. Her reply was a single sentence. "You're being rigid." I didn't defend myself. Instead, I looked at the contract open on the table, the clause on residency illuminated by the table lamp. It wasn't rigidity I felt. It was alignment, the kind that kept both sides protected. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights drifting across the living room wall like a quiet reminder of the broader world moving beyond our tension. As night pressed in, the house took on a deeper stillness. I moved room to room, checking locks out of habit, not fear. The doorbell camera glowed with its small blue ring, a steady point of awareness on the porch. Inside, the air felt cool and clean, the kind that made each breath feel deliberate. I returned to the dining table and stared at the folder for a long moment. It held every truth, every timeline, every screenshot, every clause. More than that, it held the path I had chosen, not confrontation, not avoidance, but structure. I ran my fingertips along the spine, feeling the smooth firmness beneath. She had 2 days left before the deadline. Whether she accepted the conditions or not would decide the next step. But either way, the knot had tightened into its final shape, and I no longer feared its pull. I was ready for whatever her answer would be. The morning of her deadline, I sat at the dining table with the ledger open in front of me. The numbers looked almost serene. Each entry a small truth laid precisely where it belonged. I reviewed the reimbursement timeline one more time, not because I doubted it, but because the act of reading it felt grounding. 18 months of payments. Every transfer noted, every confirmation preserved. The story they told wasn't emotional, it was architectural. It built a framework she could no longer reshape with sentiment. I printed a clean copy and placed it under the clip, smoothing the top edge with the flat of my hand. Outside, the faint sound of someone's sprinkler drifted through the open window, rhythmic and unhurried. It made the whole moment feel strangely calm, as though clarity had its own steady pulse. Next, I added the original gift document, the one she had signed, the one she had once described with pride when explaining how she helped us start our life. The language was unmistakable, non-repayable, with no conditional rights attached. I slid it into the folder beside the ledger, letting the two documents rest against each other like matching puzzle pieces. The pairing felt definitive, almost elegant. Together they separated gratitude from ownership, generosity from residency, kindness from leverage. I paused, letting the alignment settle through me. A breeze lifted the edge of the curtain, brushing cool air against my arm. It felt like the house itself was exhaling, relieved to have the truth articulated so simply. I drafted a final written summary, outlining the distinction as plainly as possible. The deposit was a gift. Reimbursement was voluntary. Residency required explicit consent. I read the lines aloud, listening to how they sounded in the quiet room. Measured, neutral, unassailable. I didn't add emotion or implication. Facts didn't need the armor of tone. When I finished, I attached the summary to the email thread we'd been using, saving it as a draft for now. My reflection in the darkened laptop screen looked calm, almost unfamiliar in its steadiness. A small knot of tension loosened at the base of my neck. It wasn't victory I felt. It was coherence. Before sending anything, I scanned the documents into one combined file. The scanner pulled each page through with a soft, even hum, paper gliding beneath the glass in a way that felt oddly ceremonial. The digital copies appeared one by one on the screen, crisp and aligned. The rhythmic motion soothed me, each page entering the system like a bead sliding onto a string. As the machine finished, a soft click echoed through the room. I gathered the originals, tapping them gently against the table to straighten the stack. A thin shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds outside, landing directly across the folder as if marking it with quiet acknowledgement. The house smelled faintly of coffee and paper, grounding, ordinary. When everything was ready, I sat back in my chair and let the stillness settle. The truth no longer felt like something I had to defend. It felt like something that simply stood. I thought briefly of the conversations she had with relatives, the stories she shaped to soften her position or strengthen her argument. But none of that changed the documents in front of me. Evidence didn't shift based on sympathy. It remained exactly what it was. I closed the folder with deliberate care, feeling the edges align beneath my fingertips. Outside, a distant dog barked once, then silence returned. Quiet, even, complete. I was ready to send the file, ready to draw the final line. And as I looked at the folder, its clean edges, its unwavering contents, I understood something simple and steady. Truth, once organized, didn't tremble. By late afternoon, I composed the final notice. The words appeared on the screen in clean, quiet lines. If you proceed with moving in without a signed agreement, it will be considered a violation of Section 4.2. No escalation, no commentary. Just the contract speaking for itself. I listed the two options beneath it: sign the residency terms or choose alternate accommodations, and added a clear date of effect. My fingers hovered for a moment before pressing send. The message left my outbox with a faint whisper, hardly louder than the soft hum of the refrigerator behind me. I sat back, feeling the stillness settle around my shoulders. Outside, a distant lawnmower droned lazily, its steady rhythm oddly grounding. The house held steady, as though acknowledging something significant had shifted from preparation to decision. Her response didn't come immediately. Minutes stretched long, filled only by the low tick of the thermostat and the muted rustling of a tree brushing the siding. When the notification finally appeared, it was a single line. "So this is how it has to be?" I reread it slowly, letting the weight of the words register without sinking into me. I typed back simply, "Yes. Fairness requires clarity from both sides." My voice didn't rise inside me. My pulse didn't spike. The simplicity of the exchange felt more like an exhale than a clash. The decision wasn't charged, it was defined. A beam of warm late-day sunlight crossed the table, resting over the folder like a small, steady illumination. I added a 30-day effective period to the notice, outlining the timeline with careful precision. Not rushed, not punitive, just structured. I sent the updated document and watched the screen return to its quiet default glow. The air in the room felt cool against my arms, the kind of temperature shift that made the walls sound faintly alive as they adjusted. A car passed outside, its tires whispering over the pavement. I leaned back in the chair and let the simplicity of the moment root me. I didn't want conflict. I wanted order. And order required boundaries that stayed in place even when someone pushed against them. For several minutes the phone stayed silent, then it buzzed once, her typing indicator appearing, disappearing, reappearing again. But no message followed. The pause felt less like hesitation, and more like the space where someone confronts a truth they can't reshape. The porch light flickered on outside, lighting the walkway in a pale, steady glow. I walked toward the window and watched, as evening settled onto the neighborhood, houses dimming one by one. The conversations of nearby families floated distantly, softened by the air. Life continued around us, unchanged by the tension threaded quietly through our own. When I returned to the table, I felt no urgency, no dread, only the calm steadiness that had carried me through each step. This wasn't about severing ties. It wasn't about victory. It was about preserving the dignity of a home, the fairness of agreements, the emotional safety of everyone who lived under the roof. I touched the folder lightly, tracing the smooth edge with my thumb. The documents inside weren't weapons, they were clarity. They gave shape to boundaries that protected both her and me, whether she recognized it yet or not. The room glowed softly under the warm dining light, shadows gathering in gentle folds across the floor. What remained now was simple. Wait. Not passively, not with fear, but with a quiet readiness. I had drawn the line clearly, respectfully. However she responded next would determine the final form of this story, but the structure was already set. The next morning, the air felt lighter than it had in weeks. I gathered the full packet from the dining table, pages numbered, clipped, and aligned, and placed it carefully into a large envelope. The paper inside made a soft rustle, like a quiet acknowledgement of how far the situation had traveled. At the clerk's office, the line was short. A man in a faded blue jacket filled out a form beside me, scribbling with hurried strokes, while a woman hummed softly as she shuffled papers at the far end of the counter. When my turn came, I handed the envelope across the metal tray. The clerk opened it, checked the pagination, and nodded. She stamped the top page with a firm press of the seal. The sound was crisp, almost ceremonial. I felt my shoulders release an inch, as if a weight had been placed correctly rather than removed. She asked if I wanted confirmation copies sent to my attorney, and I nodded. She scanned the document swiftly, the rhythmic hum of the machine aligning each page into digital permanence. A faint flash reflected on the glass with each pass. When she finished, she slid a printed confirmation toward me. Simple, unadorned, official. I tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat, the paper cool against the fabric. The clerk gave a short, professional smile, the type that held no opinion, only process. As I stepped aside to make room for the next person, I felt the moment settle around me. Not triumphant, not heavy, just quietly final. The room buzzed with everyday transactions, but for me, something meaningful had clicked into place. Back home, I forwarded the clerk's confirmation to my attorney, adding a short note. Filed and acknowledged. Nothing more was needed. The house was still when I walked inside, afternoon light stretching across the living room in long, gentle bands. I placed the new documents into the drawer with the others, the folder's spine fitting neatly beside a stack of unrelated papers, tax forms, appliance warranties, the normal architecture of life. The drawer slid shut with a smooth, soft thunk. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet surround me. No buzzing phone. No new messages. No unresolved threads demanding attention. Just stillness. I stepped into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, steady and low. Through the window above the sink, I could see the porch, washed in the calm afternoon light. A neighbor carried groceries from their car, moving with the ease of someone unburdened by tension. The ordinariness of the moment felt grounding. I took a sip of water, the coolness settling through me. The house felt like itself again, quiet, steady, unintruded upon. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but restored. For the first time in a long while, I recognized a feeling I hadn't allowed myself. Enough. I had done enough, said enough, prepared enough. The situation no longer carried heat, it carried structure. Whatever decisions she made now would unfold within the framework I had set, clear, fair, and documented. I walked to the living room and sat on the couch, letting my body sink into the cushions. The soft fabric pressed lightly against my arms, grounding me in the present. A bird chirped outside, a brief, delicate sound that reminded me the world wasn't waiting for conflict to resolve. It simply kept going. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet stretch without rushing it. The documents were filed, the notice sent, the structure locked in place. I had done everything required, carefully, respectfully, thoroughly. All that remained now was the final turn, the closing chapter waiting just beyond the next day. The story wasn't over yet, but its shape was clear, and so was mine. The next morning I opened the drawer where the folder rested, its presence now familiar rather than tense. When I lifted it out, I noticed how much thinner it seemed. Not because the papers were gone, but because the weight of uncertainty no longer clung to it. I placed it on the dining table and opened it gently. The pages lay flat, orderly, composed. Outside, early sunlight pushed through the curtains, casting a pale, steady glow across the table. I felt myself breathe more deeply than I had in weeks. The folder no longer represented conflict. It represented clarity, a quiet record of choices made with care. I straightened the stack one more time and closed the cover with a soft, deliberate press, as if acknowledging that its work was nearly done. As morning settled in, the porch light clicked on briefly, the sensor catching a shift in the breeze, before dimming again. The soft glow framed the entryway like a punctuation mark shaped from light. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the gentle sway of tree branches outside, the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood starting its day. Nothing dramatic, nothing strained. Just the ordinary pulse of life moving forward. I felt myself settle into that same rhythm. The house no longer felt tense or suspended, it felt aligned. The edges that had once felt sharp were now simply defined. The air carried a stillness that felt earned. A notification appeared on my phone. A simple email from the clerk's office. File closed. That was all it said. No commentary, no elaboration. The words rested on the screen with a quiet authority that needed nothing more. I exhaled slowly, letting the finality sink in. Not harsh, not triumphant, just final. I forwarded the confirmation to my attorney, then set the phone down on the table. The room felt even quieter after that, as though the air itself had acknowledged the close of a long thread. A soft crease of sunlight drifted across the floorboards, warming the space where I stood. Later in the afternoon, I printed a copy of the original gift letter and folded it twice, placing it inside a small envelope. No message, no explanation. Just the document, returned with the same clarity it had carried from the start. I walked to the mailbox and slipped the envelope inside, hearing the gentle metallic echo as it dropped. The sound felt like a soft release, an acknowledgement that each of us now had what we needed to stand on our own ground. When I turned back toward the house, the breeze brushed lightly across my face, carrying the scent of warm pavement and freshly cut grass. The world looked bright in a way I hadn't noticed for days. Inside, the quiet had shifted into something warmer. I set the folder back into the drawer, sliding it into place among birth certificates, warranties, and tax forms. Just another piece of life's paperwork, no longer the center of my days. I closed the drawer gently. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of release, clean and unforced. I wasn't angry. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't waiting for anything else. I simply recognized that generosity did not create obligation, and boundaries did not create distance. They created respect. As I stood in the soft afternoon light, the truth settled over me with quiet certainty. Some gifts are meant to help you begin, not bind you in return. The porch light flickered on again as evening approached, steady and clear against the deepening dusk. I watched it for a moment, the warm glow holding still like a final, quiet mark at the end of a very long sentence. In the end, it wasn't the paperwork or the clauses that brought me peace. It was the quiet certainty that I had finally chosen myself. Not out of defiance, not to prove anyone wrong, but to protect the home I built with bare hands and honest effort. When the final email arrived, file closed, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. A soft exhale after months of holding my breath. The house felt lighter, the walls settling into a calm that had been missing for far too long. I stood by the porch as the evening light flickered on, steady and warm, and realized something. Boundaries don't push people away. They show you who's willing to meet you with respect. And that, sometimes, is the quietest kind of justice. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. I'd love to know what you think. Leave a comment below and tell me how you would have handled a situation like this. And if you want more stories about family, boundaries, truth, and the quiet courage it takes to protect your peace, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.